Welcome and aloha. I am Mark Shklov, the host of ThinkTech Hawaii's Law Across the Sea program. Today we're going to talk with Mark Weeks, a lawyer who has traveled back and forth across the sea to Japan. Mark is also a new fiction author. His recent novel is a sci-fi legal thriller titled Bottled Lightning. It features a Japan-based lawyer and his very beautiful and very intelligent client. I've asked our mutual good friend, Stephen Dyer, who introduced me to Mark Weeks, to join our discussion. Now, I want to start asking you some personal questions. Your name is L. Mark Weeks. I know this seems sort of picky, but what does the L in your name stand for? I'm just curious. I mean, it's me being a lawyer.
Yeah, it's sort of it sounds like one of those pretentious waspy names, that start with an initial. But it stands for Leon, and the reason I go by Mark is historical. My grandfather was Leon Lester Weeks, and everybody called him Leon. And my father was Leon Richard Weeks, and everybody called him Richard or Dick. And then my father wanted to name me Leon. My mother did not. She wanted to name Mark. So the compromise was Leon Mark, and then they would call me Mark.
And that's how you go by it in your new book, right, Mark?
Yeah, I go by LM Weeks in the book. Yeah. So it's even more pretentious than L Mark.
Well, anybody named Mark has to be a really good guy. So,
but only Mark with a K, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. And Stephen Dyer, how are you? Good to see you.
I'm very good. Likewise, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, well, I know you have a good background with the other Mark, and I wanted you to have a chance to talk and maybe ask him some questions also. So, first, Mark, let's dive into more of the personal side of your life. And I was interested to read that you had come to Japan when you were just in high school, and ultimately you did go to college, and apparently that's where you met Steve. But why, what attracted you to Japan as a high school student from the United States?
Well, my father was a Rotarian, and we had a lovely Indian woman stay with us while she was attending university in Idaho, where I grew up. And she was the one who suggested I go on an exchange program somewhere outside of the U.S. And I thought that was a very intriguing idea. And so I did the interviews with Rotary, and they said, well, where do you want to go? And it was during my junior year of high school. And I thought about it. And one of the places I thought about going was Australia, because I'd always wanted to visit the Great Barrier Reef. But I'd met some Americans who had been to Australia and had lived there as high school exchange students. And they came back with Australian accents, basically. And so I thought it would be interesting. Fun to go to Australia, but I decided I wanted to go to someplace just completely different from the U.S. And so I chose Japan, which it turned out didn't disappoint on the completely different scale of things.
And was it anything in particular that attracted you to Japan?
I think it was the mystique. I didn't know it at the time, but so I saw this movie, which you may remember, Mark. It's The Tea House of the August Moon with Glenn.
Right. Yes.
And it would never happen today, but actually Marlon Brando played the Japanese guy. Machiko Kyo was the beautiful young Japanese love interest for Glenn Ford, who played a military officer who'd gone to Japan right after World War II. And I saw that, and it was a very cute movie. Even Marlon Brando did a good job. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I want to go there. And as you know, Japan is completely different. It's a country, the culture and the society, which is not based upon Judeo-Christian norms or Greek thought at all. It developed wholly independently, obviously influenced heavily by Buddhism from India and by China, but just completely different from everything about the civilization is completely different from what we would consider to be the Western canon, so to speak.
So what year was this, and what was it like, and what did your parents think too?
So it was, I think, so my mother was not excited about it at all, but she was sort of boxed in because my father was a Rotarian and my grandfather was a Rotarian. And here we had this exchange student staying with us. So it was kind of hard for her to say no to that. I think my father thought it would be a good experience to go away for a year. And he was right, which it was. But this was 1978. Pre-internet, obviously. And I ended up being sent to a relatively small town in northern Japan, in Aomori. And actually that, even though it was a small town by Japan standards, it was about 280,000 people. And I came from a town of 18,000 people in Idaho. So it was a metropolis by my standards, but it was nowhere near any U.S. Air Force or Navy or Army base. So we didn't even get Far Eastern Network. And consequently, it was really full immersion in Japanese. And that turned out to be really helpful for learning Japanese.
And then ultimately, you and Steve went to college together. Now, Steve, what do you have to ask or talk about with Mark about your college background?
Yeah, so we met at International Christian University, more commonly known as ICU. And I think it's pretty well known here in Hawaii as well. There's an ICU OB Kai, an old, ICU alumni group that meets here. So I think it's pretty well known here too. There's a very interesting history of ICU. Mark, you were there for 4 years. I was only there for 15 months as a specialist.
Well, I think you may actually know it better than I do, but the university was set up after World War II, and it was financed by Protestant Christian churches that banded together to provide the necessary funding to build the university in a spot in Western Tokyo, which is really a beautiful spot, but it was where, as I recall, it was Fuji Heavy Industries made bombers before and during the war. So there was a giant, there still is, airstrip that goes into. It's not an airstrip now, but it's a straight road that goes into the middle of the campus, and it was obviously an airstrip, and now it's lined with cherry trees. And even when Steve and I were there in the early '80s. They were still finding unexploded ordnance because the Americans had bombed it into oblivion. Except somehow, notwithstanding that carpet bombing, they managed to miss the main building, which is still there to this day. It was the main admin headquarters, and so it's Christian, but it's Protestant Christian. It's open to all denominations, and they have professors from all over the world visit, from Europe and the US and Australia, and obviously lots of Japanese professors as well. So they teach courses in both Japanese and English, which was really a nice mix. And then for those who are not proficient in Japanese, you're required to take very intense Japanese courses, and the same thing for people, so native Japanese who are going to college there have to take these very intense English language courses.
And that's where you became bilingual. Would that be right to say that?
Yeah, I got a really nice base in Aomori, being there for a year, but going to ICU in a very structured way forced me to learn the written language and learn how to read. and that was extremely helpful. And then being on the campus, obviously, you spoke Japanese a lot with people.
So you did some high school and college in Japan, and ultimately you returned to the United States, went to law school, became a lawyer, worked in New York City for 15 years, and then you moved to Tokyo in 2004. Why would you leave your law practice in New York? I mean,
so I didn't. Back. Yeah, so it's the looking back now, the progression seemed, it's almost like it was mapped out that way. But when I was a junior associate, I was seconded to a Japanese law firm for 18 months. And that was great experience too, because working at a large New York law firm, typically you spend lots of time in the library and lots of time researching and drafting memos, and not a lot of time meeting with clients. And when you did meet with clients, you only spoke when you were spoken to, kind of thing, as a junior associate. And you were rarely asked questions. The partner and the senior associate did all the talking. But when I went to Japan, I remember the first meeting I had with TDK. Remember, they made the cassette tapes, and it was an intellectual property matter. And the managing partner of the Japanese firm, Kumakura Sensei, great lawyer, great guy. After getting the facts from the client and opining informally, turned to me and said, "Weeks, what do you think?" And I thought internally, in my head, am I allowed to have an opinion? But then every day was like that. I was asked to join these meetings, and then they were asking me, "Well, what are your thoughts on, what do you think we should do?" And here I am, a third-year associate, and I'm advising these major Japanese companies. So that was excellent experience, both as a practitioner and also from a linguistic standpoint, because I had to respond in Japanese.
Wow! So all of your background is pointing you towards Japan, and ultimately went to Japan.
Right. So what happened was, while I was there, this was 91 and 92, the Japanese bubble, the famous economic bubble, was bursting. And so I get back to Japan, and I'd spent all this time helping companies and banks open up subsidiaries and set up subsidiaries and open up branches in the US. And then in the 90s, I spent a lot of time helping them close those and restructure their businesses. But there were still some deals going on. And then I was doing a lot of internet related, .com related work in the latter half of the 90s. And then I changed firms in 2001. I went from Hughes Hubbard, where I'd become a partner, to Orrick, Harrington and Sutcliffe. And I changed firms in New York. And I was there. They had a Tokyo office, which was one of the reasons I moved there, because I still had a Japan practice. And they had a Silicon Valley office, which was also attractive because of the technology side of my practice. So I moved to Orrick in New York, and the Tokyo office kept growing. And I was spending more and more time there. And then my son graduated from high school. And so just the timing worked out quite well. And I just decided, the firm kept pushing me. Wouldn't you, like to be in Japan? And so I ended up going. And it turned out to be a very good move. And my deal, I was very happy in New York. So my deal with the firm was, okay, I'll go for 2 years. And then, of course, I ended up staying until 2021.
Wow. Now, there's been a little change in your life. You've become an author.
Yes.
And Steve, you know Mark well, and you have some questions about this book he's written, or this novel.
Well, I've stayed in touch with Mark over the years, and it's pretty funny. Last time I visited him before he came today was in New York City. He was talking about taking me fishing on the Hudson, and I passed. Instead, we went to a karaoke bar and sat next to Godzilla. What was it? Hideki Matsui, and the three of us were singing karaoke in Japanese in New York City. It was quite a, but anyway, past that, you know, he told me he was going to write this book. And so he asked me to be a beta reader. And I'm like, what's a beta reader? And he says, it's somebody who reads the first draft and gives, you know, feedback. So I gladly did that. Mark, you can take it from there. But one of the advice or comments that I made was, you know, Mark's character in the book, the protagonist, which is, we can talk about, but he had a sidekick. You know, everybody has to have a sidekick, you know, Batman and Robin. And so Robin was a Russian living in Japan. And I recommended that, you know, I thought that was pretty cool. I had a lot of applications, but I recommended that he change that character to a Hapa guy from Hawaii. So Mark, take it from there.
There was also some other advice that came from Steve and a good friend of Steve's, David Lopina, who also lives in Hawaii, who said the main character was a white guy from America practicing law in Japan. And their suggestion was, well, what if he were Hapa? And so I really started thinking about it, and I ended up changing that character. My son is biracial, and I have lots of friends who have biracial children, and so I decided, okay, that's interesting. I'll change the main character, and I actually ended up changing. The client was actually biracial too. The client who created the invention. So it ended up, they're both of them are biracial.
Yeah, let me interrupt. Briefly, you know, give us a brief description of what your novel Bottled Lightning is all about then.
So it's this lawyer practicing at the Tokyo office. He runs the Tokyo office of this big global technology firm. And he has this client who's developed this lightning on demand technology that is ready for commercialization and will replace all existing energy sources, including fossil fuels and renewable energy and nuclear energy.
Wow.
Well, this would disrupt the entire energy market, obviously. And there are lots of countries and companies and individuals that would be unhappy to be pushed out of the market completely. And so they find out relatively quickly that their lives are in danger. And that's how the story starts.
Well, you know, it's kind of interesting. You have a Japan-based lawyer. Sounds familiar.
Yeah, right.
Involved in intellectual property things. Is this somebody we know? Is this based on somebody we know?
Well, you know, one of the axioms is that you should write what you know. And I considered some other ideas, but I decided that I would write what I know because I have had a lot of experiences over the years that I thought would be relevant. The P.D. James, who's a UK author, has a famous quote, something to the effect that all fiction is autobiographical and much autobiography is fiction, which I think is really true. If you look at Hemingway's work, for example, it's all autobiographical. Basically, or Tom McGuane, a lot of his work is autobiographical. Now, it's not true for every author. I'm sure for Stephen King that many of his stories are not autobiographical, if not all of them. But I'm sure there's some of him in there somewhere.
So you drew from some of your own experiences.
Yes, absolutely.
That makes, and I understand that. And I noticed, you know, that I saw the names of the characters. Am I pronouncing it right? Tornay,
yeah.
Sagara is the lawyer based in Japan, Tokyo based, right?
Yeah.
And he has a beautiful client who did the invention.
Right.
Called Saya Brooks, is that right?
Yeah, Saya, right.
Now, are these names significant in any way? I was just curious.
Well, yeah, it's a really good question because the working title for Torn, which is short for Tornay, it was Malcolm, and I think it was Steve or David Lupina said that reminded him of Malcolm in the Middle, and he didn't think that was a good connection or connotation. And I wasn't familiar with Malcolm in the Middle because I'd been living in Japan at the time that was popular. But I took the point, and I also thought, okay, well, if I'm going to make this person biracial, chances are their name is not going to be Malcolm. And his mother, Torn's mother, she's a Caucasian American lawyer from Alaska. And so I started thinking, okay, if he's from Alaska, his father's Japanese, but if he's from Alaska, is there some name that's unique to Alaska that might be interesting? And it dawned on me that lots of stories over the years, over the centuries, the names of the characters often come from mythology or religion. And some people believe mythology and religion are the same thing, but that's neither here nor there. And they're biblical, for example. So I did some research on local Inuit mythology, and one of the deities that popped up is called a Torne. And a Torne can be either good or bad. And I thought that fit with Torn's personality because he has a flawed personality. He's human like all of us, but and he's very helpful to certain people, but he's also got this dark side. And I thought that was perfectly consistent with his personality. Plus, just the word torn is also consistent because he's conflicted. He has commitment issues and he's conflicted. And being torn, I thought, was also a nice play on words. So, and then Saya is a beautiful name. I really like that name. And it's a name that's easy for non-Japanese to pronounce. And, a lot of biracial children are given names that are relatively easy for both Japanese. Some of them they're Japanese names, but they're all like Naomi, but they're well known in English as well. Just as an aside, one of my friends, for example, did not think this through. And he named his son, his middle name is Yusuke, and Yusuke is spelled Yusuke, right? And he said his sister in the US called him up after he'd announced the name and said, "Why would you ever name your son Yusuke?" So these names some thought needs to go into them.
Okay, now we're getting close to the end. I do have one question I want to ask, but Steve, you have any closing question you'd like to ask Mark about?
Mark, how the book starts is riding a motorcycle. One of the reasons I look forward to reading this book is because it's essentially an autobiography of you. And so tell people about the motorcycle component.
Well, I love riding motorcycles, and Japan is a great place to ride motorcycles because the roads are really well maintained. There are a lot of beautiful, very windy mountain roads that are switchbacks that are in beautiful mountains, and also along the coast. Of course, it has a very extensive coastline, and it's also a really good place to ride motorcycles because cars are used to sharing the road with motorcycles, so they're looking for you, which is not necessarily true in the U.S. And when I was living in Japan, I had this wonderful BMW motorcycle, and I've had motorcycles since I was in college, and we used to do crazy street racing, and so I've always liked motorcycles, and I've over the years I've seen some very cool motorcycle scenes in movies, and it just seemed like something very cinematic. So I wrote a lot in the book about motorcycles, and actually more than half of what I originally wrote ended up on the cutting room floor, so to speak. I remember one of my editors, my first editor, one of his comments was less motorcycle fetishness. So I actually had to cut it way back because not everybody is as passionate about it.
Well, it sounds like you've taken a lot of things from your life, and also that your book sounds really exciting. But I want to close out here. We have about a minute left, and I want to ask you, your history in Japan, your background in Japan, what you've been doing. Do you have any favorite Japanese cultural expression or words of wisdom that you'd like to share with us, both in Japanese and English?
Well, this is actually not, I mean, it is a Japanese expression and it's not. It's not in the sense that it was actually coined by an American in the 19th century, William Clark, who went to Japan, was hired to go to Japan. He was famous in academia for developing a school in the U.S. He was a professor at Amherst, and he actually fought in the Civil War as well, William Clark. But he was hired by the Japanese to go to Hokkaido and start this agricultural university. He was a chemist and a geologist, and he started this university, which is now Hokkaido University. And when he left, he said, "Boys, be ambitious." And it's part of a much longer quote, basically about what it means to be a man. And "Boys, be ambitious" is very popular in Japan, right? It's shonen yo taishu o idake. And I've always thought, I heard that when I first heard that, I think it was in Hawaii in 1979. And I've always thought that was a great thing to encourage young men to be.
Well, words of encouragement are good to hear at this time in our own history. So thank you. Mark Weeks, Stephen Dyer, thank you both for having this discussion today. And I look forward to reading your novel. It just, Bottled Lightning sounds really great. And I look forward to reading it. And then I'll talk to you some more. So aloha, both of you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.